Okay, are we on? Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you were able to join us today for this webinar. I'm Dan Misla, the director of the Catholic Climate Covenant. We have an excellent presentation for you this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, wherever you are in a time zone. We're calling it Laudato Si, a framework for climate justice. The Catholic Climate Covenant, as you know, inspires and equips Catholic people and institutions to care for creation and care for the poor. Through our 14 national Catholic partners, we guide the U.S. Church's efforts in response to climate change by educating, giving public witness, and offering resources. As we begin, I just wanted to start with a prayer, and this is the last part of one of Pope Francis's prayers that he put in Laudato Si at the very end. I'm sure you know them well. So let's just take a moment and quiet ourselves and be in God's presence as we begin this webinar. And God, we ask you, touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. So before we get started, just a couple of bookkeeping or housekeeping items, and then we'll begin. So this video is being recorded. It will be sent to all who registered after the webinar is over. There will be a Q&A session after all the presentations, last 10-15 minutes of the hour that we have allotted for this. You can submit your questions in writing at the chat, in the chat bar and the box at the left of your computer screen. You may need to scroll down to see the box. We may not have time to get all the questions, but we'll work to get as many in as possible. We're excited to offer this webinar. An understanding of the racial, economic, and environmental justice issues confronting people of color and vulnerable communities is an essential part of essential starting point to our work on climate justice and integral ecology. And apparently we've hit a nerve. We're excited to let you know that over 900 people have registered for the webinar from 6 of the 7 continents. I'm not sure why the people in Antarctica haven't dialed in, but I suppose it's the middle of the winter down there. So welcome everybody, we're glad you're here. Today we're delighted to welcome 3 incredibly knowledgeable speakers who will help us unpack these terms and gain an understanding of how climate jeopardizes the health of our children, the elderly, and those with chronic illnesses, and disproportionately impacts communities and people of color. We will learn how Laudato Si is a helpful framework to understand and act on issues of climate justice. And we will see how people of faith, those of us on this call and around the world, can respond to the challenges of environmental racism. So I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers and then allow each of them to give a presentation in turn. So we're very delighted to have Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington, who is the Chief Environmental Research Scientist at Environmental Health Research Associates. She's an environmental epidemiologist, environmental engineer, and environmental historian with 30 years of research experience working on the impact of industrial pollution on human health and ecosystems. Dr. Hood Washington was recently trained as a climate reality leader with an interest in communicating climate change to environmental justice communities in the Great Lakes region. She is a published author and the creator and editor-in-chief of the first international environmental health disparities journal, Environmental Justice. In 2012, she was appointed by Governor Patrick Quinn to sit on the first Environmental Justice Commission for the state of Illinois. Dr. Hood Washington is a Third Order Franciscan. And just on a personal note, she and I go back to the mid-90s when she was intimately involved with the environmental justice programs at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Dr. Hood Washington will speak on environmental racism, climate justice, and Laudato Si. Secondly, Katelyn Roedner Sutter is Program Director of the Environmental Justice Project at Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Stockton, California. Katelyn graduated from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. with a BA in International Affairs and with an economic focus and a minor in religion. Katelyn taught high school in New Orleans with Teach for America before moving to California. She received her MA in ethics from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, before working at Catholic Charities. And finally, our third speaker will be Edgar Garibay. He's the Stanislaus Program Coordinator of the Environmental Justice Project at Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Stockton and works with Katelyn. Edgar has a BS in Psychological Sciences and a BS in Biological Sciences and a minor in Chemistry, as well as a concentration in genetics. If that's not enough, he's also working to finish his doctorate in public health to be able to help the most vulnerable communities. Edgar grew up in Mexico and came to California at the age of 8. So please welcome Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington. Her presentation is entitled Laudato Si, Guideline for Creating Sustainable Communities for All, People of our God and King. Dr. Washington, go ahead.
Well, first I'd like to thank Dan and the Catholic Climate Covenant for inviting me to make this presentation. I know we're limited in time, so I'm going to try to step through this presentation in a very concise way. I want to start the presentation, however, with two quotes from the Bible, which really, I think, gets at the heart of climate justice and environmental racism from a Catholic perspective, and I think which is really running throughout Laudato Si. And the first one I'm sure many of us have heard over and over again is from Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. But then in Psalm 139, verse 6, there's another one which I think is appropriate for this presentation. It says, your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book we were all written in the days that were ordained for us, when as yet they were not to come. And so for Franciscans, when I have read Laudato Si and I've made presentations, one of the parables that comes closest to me in terms of making people understand what climate justice is in Laudato Si is the story of the wolf of Gubbio. And here, this story is really a sustainability story, and it reflects what's happening to people who are environmentally disenfranchised, people who are considered as others. The wolf, if you get into the story of Francis, is basically attacking the community because his surroundings have been taken over. He can no longer eat. He can no longer provide for himself. And his very body is suffering from this. Likewise, in Laudato Si, we have an earth that's being corrupted, where people can no longer drink water, can no longer eat food. And in many cases, as we'll see in the slide, this assault on their bodies and their community actually will change their behavior. Laudato Si is not just a discussion about
can I interrupt you for a minute?
And and temperature change. A deep read of Laudato Si is a read that tells us that we have to protect the very human beings that are a part of our environment. We are, in fact, changing human beings in the womb from environmental cells. And so, in the beginning of Laudato Si, the sister cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. And this is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor, as she groans into our God. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, in all forms of life. Now, when I was asked to make this presentation, I was discussing it with a very prominent scholar, David Tello, at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He said about Laudato Si this statement, which I'm allowed to quote. He says, I'm so glad to see you're presenting Laudato Si, and this is such a hugely important document. And the Pope has done so much to bring environmental justice-related issues to the world in ways that 1,000 scholars could not. So this is one of our most prominent environmental scholars in the United States at UC Santa Barbara. I was so delighted. I was so ecstatic as a Catholic to have the opportunity to see Laudato Si presented to the world. And although, as Dan has introduced me, I have been very deeply involved as a scholar in environmental justice, I can honestly say that I have never seen any document that has been so cogent, so precise, and interweaving all the issues of environmental justice and climate justice into one document. Climate change for me became something, I don't know, it just sort of passed over my head like it passed over many people who are just struggling with environmental justice issues. When they had the march, the 350.org march in 2014, it suddenly dawned on me that my own mother, who had been a nurse and a very devout Catholic, was a victim of climate change. And I want to talk about types of people like her. She was 56 years old. She was in her prime. She knew about health. She knew about nutrition. She was a dietitian. But she did not understand the relationship between and what it could do to her body, and neither did her family. And so we lost her at 56, and she left behind 26 grandchildren and 8 children. I think it's actually prescient that Laudato Si came out immediately before the Flint, Michigan debacle in the United States. As a member of the Environmental Justice Commission for the state of Illinois, we had the opportunity, since the state of Illinois is in Region 5, we had the opportunity to actually listen to people in Michigan talk about what created this situation, this horrible environmental injustice for the communities of color in Flint, Michigan. And in this situation, what we learned was that, as the Pope alluded, states very clearly in Laudato Si, that the decision to change the treatment of water in Flint, Michigan, violating at least 3 major regulations, was done to save money. It was done to reduce the cost to the city. But in this case, as we see in Laudato Si, it was done at the expense of the lives of children and pregnant women and the elderly and the poor. And so what is environmental justice? And this is, again, it's a definition that we see again and again in the Laudato Si. Environmental justice is our cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions that threaten not only to change our bodies, but also to destroy our homes if we talk about climate change. We only need to think about Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, when we saw thousands of people die from this change in weather pattern that we know is tied to climate change. I want to go back to Laudato Si in Flint, Michigan, and the lead poisoning. And so we see industrial waste and the chemical products utilized in cities and agricultural areas can lead to bioaccumulation in organisms of the local population. In the case of Flint, we're talking about the bioaccumulation in the bodies of the population, the most socially and economically disenfranchised, with a 60% poverty rate. Look at what lead does to the human body. We know that for lead poisoning, over 500,000 children between the ages of 1 and 5 have high lead levels. We also know that there are 24 million homes in the United States that had deteriorated lead-based paint. This actual slide by the CDC was done before the Flint, Michigan case. So we actually have a lead burden that we already knew about, which was the lead paint that was inside the homes. But now we also have the lead paint, the lead in our water that was done because government officials decided to save money at the cost of human life. The hideous part about Flint, Michigan, is that it was done in a city that was majority minority. And as Pope Francis says, let us not only keep the poor of the future in mind, but also consider today's poor, whose life on this earth is brief and who cannot keep on waiting. So as Catholics, those of us who own property in poor areas, we have to think about what it is that we're doing as property owners. What are we doing as neighbors? Are we sitting back and being silent when we have people whose lives are actually being changed at their very core being because somebody's trying to save a dollar? And when we change, and when we save that money, when the money was saved in lead, look at this. In order for lead to actually harm a human being, a child, we're looking at having lead at levels of 5 micrograms per deciliter. In the city of Michigan, the lead was at 2.3. The best testing was at 27 micrograms per deciliter, or parts per billion in lead. In our call with the Illinois EPA and our Environmental Justice Commission, we actually was told that some of the lead levels had exceeded over 200 milligrams per deciliter, not 27, but 10 times that amount. What does lead do to a child's body? It impacts its IQ. It damages their nervous system. It creates kidney problems. One of the things that very few people understand is that lead exposures in the womb is actually tied to about 30% of all violent crimes in cities. And so this exposure of lead in the womb actually is tied to violence in our cities. Every human being has a right to be born as God created them. Every human being has a right to be born as God has created. And this is what Laudato Si says. All of us who read Laudato Si must come away with the idea that when we make these decisions to assault the earth, we're actually also complicit with decisions to assault the human being as it is being formed. God knows these children before they are born. We should be cognizant of that and respect the fact that life begins in the womb, that we have every social, moral, and religious responsibility to protect children in the womb. No one should be born with a higher tendency to violence. No one should be born with a higher tendency to have a low IQ and not be able to function in society. One of the other major poisons that plague the cities and other poor areas around the world is mercury poison. Now, mercury poison is also tied to climate change and global warming. As a former environmental engineer working for the fossil fuel industry, one of the major sources of mercury comes from fossil fuel production, generation. And so look at what mercury poison does to the body. Causes loss of speech, social withdrawal, reduced IQ, temper tantrums, and seizures. Again, another example of what we do as human beings in terms of utilizing chemicals or being complicit with the production of chemicals. In this case, complicit with the production of fossil fuel power plants that generate mercury, which becomes methylmercury, and then poisons our children and impacts their brain. Look at who is impacted by mercury poisoning. In this particular slide, you can see that non-Hispanic children have the greatest impact from mercury than children who are non-Hispanic white or even Mexican American. So who is impacted by pollution across the globe is determined very much by race and ethnicity. The other category that I wanted my audience to understand, especially in the United States, is the poison that we have in communities that are Superfund communities. And so the slides here is toxins in our environment, cancer in our bodies. In the particular area in Illinois that we live in, there's 5 Superfund sites that were created by radioactive waste, the permitee Superfund sites. And we know as environmental epidemiologists, we know that there's so many chemicals in these Superfund sites that actually contribute to cancer, causes cancer. And so we have to be more aware that what we're doing, how we're regulating industries, the oversight of these industries once they're shut down and the waste streams they leave behind in communities are actually poisoning their bodies. And so we have to have a commitment to our society, a love for our neighbor to make sure that these sites are cleaned up. We have high rates of lung cancer, brain cancer, bone cancer. All this is occurring at this one particular site because of thorium waste. We're dealing with issues here where the community has been very reluctant to inform other individuals moving into the Superfund site about the fact that it was a Superfund site, so now we're having a resurgence of cancer due to this exposure. We have to care about our fellow human beings, and this is one of the things that runs throughout Laudato Si. Look at who lives next to a Superfund. Who is most likely to live near a Superfund site? Regardless of income, we see that Native Americans, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have a much higher percentage of people living near Superfund sites. If we go below the poverty line, those who are racial and ethnic minorities, and then we add on top of it socioeconomic disadvantage, we see these numbers jump from 10% to almost 12% for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. It jumps for African Americans from 8% to a little over 10%. And so our ability to protect life in its most fragile stages is a measure of our civilization. And we have been fortunate to have a Pope who has articulated this point over and over and over again. If we cannot protect a human being, if we cannot protect children, when they are at their most fragile stages, then what type of world are we creating? What type of people are we? Our faith informs us that we should be protecting life at all stages. And I've shown you the slides to show you who actually is being impacted the most, which is children. Asthma, which is a very important disease, especially in the age of climate change, is a disease that impacts mostly children and women and people of color, Blacks and Puerto Ricans in the United States. And if you're poor, you have a much higher probability of having asthma than if you're not poor. And so what are the health effects of climate change? We see that the stagnant air masses produced by climate change will exacerbate the diseases of asthma and cardiovascular disease. We also know that the heat waves which we're now experiencing in the United States is over 150 million people now across 27 states in the United States that are now wrestling with this heat wave. This climate change, this increase in temperature will also increase morbidity and mortality for cardiovascular disease and cause heat stress. And we've already seen the loss of life issues in the United States due to drowning. But those individuals who do not have the social economic tools and resources to protect themselves against climate change are at greater risk. The people who don't have air conditioning. In the case of Katrina, the people who died in Katrina were the ones who could not get out of the city. They did not have the social economic resources to get out of the city. And so Laudato Si is saying we must turn our attention to protecting the most vulnerable in our society. So again, here's a slide of individuals who are most likely to deal with climate change. Our elderly, those individuals suffer from chronic respiratory diseases. These levels have been steadily increased over the last few decades. Those with diabetes, those who have high obesity rates. Diabetes and obesity rates have been an epidemic in the African American and minority communities and in the poor community. And those who are poor will also have the highest vulnerability to climate change. 11 things that Laudato Si. I wanted to highlight the things that people need to focus on, which comes out of Laudato Si. Okay? We need to help the poor, and we need to do it more than just by giving out candy. We need to save the baby humans. We know that exposures to chemicals in the womb changes the babies before they are born. We also know as environmental epidemiologists, there's a field called environmental genomics. There are chemicals that we have released, man-made chemicals that we have released into the environment that actually causes more mutations in our DNA that's carried through for generations. So it's saved the baby humans, but it's basically saved humanity. It also, the change that we want in society is not just about politics. We have to have a change in heart. And I think Laudato Si is that template for telling us and leading us to a change in heart, for making us focus on the fact that our changes in society that are created by our greed, by our need to advance society through technology has a cost, and that cost is a human being. So the journal that Dan mentioned, I really would like everyone in the audience who are grounded in their faith, who have read Laudato Si, to send me articles. We're running articles now on Flint, Michigan, but I think there is a need to have articles that are faith-based articles on climate justice and environmental justice, so that we have a global audience to see how faith can move mountains. In this case, how faith can help people across the world who have been exposed to chemicals or struggling with climate change. How is our faith changing the world for the better and saving humanity? And finally, after 35 years of being an environmental scholar, being an environmental scientist, I grew weary of just talking about the bad news. So now our organization has formed a 501c3 where we've actually shown how we can go in and reduce people's reactions to asthma, to chronic obstruction pulmonary disease, to help them deal with issues of lead exposure. And I think this organization is a model for what can be done by Catholics and people who really want to walk the talk and to actually embrace Laudato Si. We need to get out and we need to be functioning proactively to help these communities deal with these environmental exposures and the diseases that come with it. And that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. We're hoping that we'll have a little bit better luck with the next set of presentations, and that'll be with both Katelyn and Edgar. They'll talk about the challenges in the California San Joaquin Valley. So, Katelyn, go ahead. You're on. Oh, I'm going to unmute you. Can someone unmute Katelyn, please? There we go. Katelyn, can you hear us?
I can, yeah. Thank you very much. Can you hear us okay?
You. Yep, you sound great. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to all of you this afternoon. Like Dan said, I'm Katelyn Roedner Sutter. I'm the Environmental Justice Program Director here at Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Stockton, California. I'll give you a little bit of background. Our environmental justice project started back in 2006, so we're celebrating 10 years already this year. We have three main areas of focus. The first is advocacy on state policy, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those specific issues in a minute. But specifically policy that has an environmental justice impact. So specifically things like air quality or water quality that have a disproportionate impact on our most vulnerable residents. The second area is community organizing and advocacy on issues related to the built environment. So this is housing, transportation, land use, that sort of thing. When these are done poorly, they also have a disproportionate impact on poor and vulnerable communities. And the third area of our work is parish engagement on environmental justice issues. So this is making connections between Catholic social teaching and environmental justice, programs on Laudato Si, and creating or connecting parishioners to opportunity for environmental justice action. So the photo you see on the screen is from a Clean Air Action Day that we did with our partners at the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. These are community members from all over San Joaquin Valley at our state capital in Sacramento advocating for cleaner air. Edgar, who you're going to hear from in just a second, was here along with several parishioners from one of our parishes in Stanislaus County. You may also be wondering why Catholic Charities has an interest in environmental justice. We do have all of the traditional social services that you think of as the purview of Catholic Charities, but these same clients have dramatic rates of asthma, little access to healthy food, and they live in unsafe and unhealthy neighborhoods like you were just hearing about. These issues all disproportionately impact poor neighborhoods and communities of color. Our motto at Catholic Charities is help for today and hope for tomorrow. As our services are meeting the immediate needs for food stamps or temporary housing today, we are also addressing some of the root causes of poor health or lack of adequate housing, both of which are part of environmental justice. So before we talk specifically about farm workers, we're going to set the scene for you a little bit. The San Joaquin Valley, we talk about it sometimes as a land of contradictions. It's about 250 miles from Stockton up in the north where we are to Bakersfield in the south. It is also the largest region of Class 1 soil, which is the best kind of soil in the world. So if you look at that brown region on the map, that is the San Joaquin Valley. In the north, you see Stockton and Modesto. That's our diocese. But many of the worst conditions we're going to talk about today are actually further south in San Joaquin Valley, near Fresno, down towards Bakersfield. The San Joaquin Valley is home to over 4 million residents, and 46% of those are Latino, but there's also a significant Hmong and Filipino and other Southeast Asian communities. The valley is known as the fruit basket of the world. There are over 230 different crops that are grown here, including the vast majority of carrots, tomatoes, cantaloupes, almonds, and grapes that we eat here in the United States, not to mention many more crops. Agriculture is a $45 billion industry in California, and much of that is from the San Joaquin Valley. But the reality is, at the same time, over 1 in 4 people in the valley struggle to get enough to eat every day, which is higher than both our state and national averages. Per capita income is below the state of Mississippi's, which is $32,000. So the valley is poorer than the poorest state on income than any other state in the nation. And based on your zip code in San Joaquin Valley, life expectancy can vary by over 20 years. So residents of wealthier neighborhoods are living much longer than poor, generally Latino residents in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So as you can see, San Joaquin Valley is a land of incredible food productivity, but at the same time, our people are going hungry. It's a land of incredible wealth, but our people are poor. And it's a land of huge disparities and inequality. But it's also a land of hope. The San Joaquin Valley is home of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers movement. And we have a very compelling history in agriculture. But the San Joaquin Valley has a long way to go for social, economic, and environmental justice. So we're going to share a couple of the key environmental justice impacts on farm workers here in the Valley. The first is air quality. In the annual State of the Air report from the American Lung Association, the major San Joaquin Valley cities continuously rank in the top 5 for worst air quality in the United States. We always think of Los Angeles as the poster child for poor air, but please remember the San Joaquin Valley is just as bad, if not worse. And because of this, over 1 in 6 kids are diagnosed with asthma before 18, and the rates are even higher in Latino communities. And then I always wonder how many kids have asthma and it has never been diagnosed. Because the valley is so rural and much of the region is unincorporated, there are often big gaps in public infrastructure for clean water. So a lot of people rely on private wells, which are very expensive. And when they go dry or get contaminated, it's often tens of thousands of dollars for a new one. For example, the town of East Porterville in Tulare County, which is down in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, is actually unincorporated, and many of the residential wells dried up last year. So residents lived for over a year with these huge donated water tanks on their roofs and showering at mobile showers in church parking lots. Because aside from no money to drill a new well, there was no groundwater left to drill to. A negative byproduct of all of this agriculture activity are the fertilizers and pesticides that have contaminated some soil and water and made some of our water undrinkable. And irrigation has rendered some tracts of land too salty for any farming. And then perhaps the headliner. California is now on year 5 of drought. Revenues for many crops are falling, land is lying fallow, and unemployment, which is already well above state and national averages at 10%, is climbing even higher. So this is just a little picture for you of the San Joaquin Valley, some of the issues that we are facing here. And I'm going to hand it over to Edgar to talk specifically about farm workers and some of the environmental challenges that they face.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Garibay, as Katelyn had previously mentioned. Thank you. And as we continue our discussion, as we look at this, over 400,000 people are employed as farm workers in California, and most are in the San Joaquin Valley. The residents are by far the most vulnerable and most exploited. In fact, over 90% of residents, of farm workers are Latino, and of those, men with families that are supporting them. The median income is about $20,000 a year, and over 60% of the workforce are undocumented. While most are men, there are a lot of women who work in the fields, orchards, vineyards as well. And we will hear one such story in just a moment. There are also a number of related industries which are major employers of Latinos, including canneries, fruit packing, meat packing, dairies, and slaughterhouses. These can also be seasonal positions, and also typical low wage can also be dangerous work. A key thing to remember is that any impact in climate change has on agriculture, it is going to be felt by farm workers as well. As temperatures continue to rise, crops that grow well in a certain area change, and farm workers may have to can destroy crops, which leaves farm workers out of work. Pest, disease, drought all impact agriculture and farm workers as well. The biggest issues we've seen in our region are air quality, the ongoing drought, and extreme heat. We mentioned very briefly poor air quality, and it comes from many sources, including trucks that ship all of the food, farm equipment, pesticides, dust, burning fields, manure emissions, and poor indoor air quality from inadequate housing like mold and mildew. Many of the same emissions contributed to climate change are also making men and women in the field sick. Much of the air pollution is in the form of what is referred to as particulate matter, which lodges into our lungs and organs and can cause asthma, respiratory, and cardiovascular issues. It's hard to give an exact number because many farm workers do not seek medical treatment for a variety of reasons. But the general assessment is that almost 20% of adults have asthma during their lifetime in the San Joaquin Valley, and the rates among farm workers are much higher. Katelyn did mention the drought, and in addition to the over 500,000 acres that are left fallow, when fields are planted, the yields are much lower. Strawberries, for example, are much smaller and are fewer per plant. Many farm workers are paid by the box or pound, so this can mean a significant decrease in your earnings. There's also fewer jobs to go around. One farm worker town, for example, Mendota in Fresno County, has normally 34% unemployment. It has grown to over 50% with the drought, and this community is 97% Latino. The hot, dry weather causing our drought has also had a dramatic impact on the health of farm workers. While water is required to be provided and breaks are mandated when temperatures rise, many farm workers refuse both because they are paid by how much they pick, and taking a break can also mean losing wages. A heat wave in San Joaquin Valley back in 2006 caused 146 deaths, and many of these were poor Latinos. With 2016 predicted to be the hottest year on record, this trend is ongoing, and it's going to get worse. And not surprisingly, all of these issues are likely to worsen with climate change. We're going to briefly share a story with you from a former farm worker. We will call her Monica, and she is a resident of the Diocese of Stockton. Monica has worked in agriculture for about 20 years. She has mostly worked picking cherries and blueberries, and at times she worked in a nut packaging plant here locally. She would also work in Oregon and Washington picking other vegetations like apples. In the past couple of years, due to the drought, she would be forced to go to work in the states of Oregon or Washington. She mentioned that in one year particularly, a subcontractor promised the workers living arrangements in one of the previously mentioned states. Yet when they arrived, there was no housing. She and other workers had no other choice than to sleep outside in the fields. The conditions were deplorable. They only had one working bathroom. The stove was turned on all day to keep the food warm. Many workers like herself had no choice but to stay because they could not afford to come back home. Monica has suffered a few setbacks physically while working in the fields over the past 10 years. While she was picking cherries or blueberries, she would feel a loss of breath. They were the beginnings of asthma. She also suffered carpal tunnel and required surgery. The drought and climate change has definitely impacted Monica greatly. This past year, Monica decided it was time for a career change. She loved agriculture, but she could no longer endure the arduous labor. She reached out to a nonprofit organization, California Human Development, to inquire about their employment training. Today, Monica has been working with the nonprofit organization for the last 5 years. In the end, she wished she could have sought other opportunities than earlier in her life. She stated, "I'm a U.S. citizen and had so many opportunities. It is hard to think of other people that work in the fields and do not have similar opportunities, whether it is their immigration status or it is a need. All of us that work in agriculture work in poor conditions, and some get taken advantage of." Monica's story illustrates the interrelated issues of the dignity of work, environmental justice, and the exploitation of immigrants. Environmental injustice is inherently tied to how we treat the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society, people who are poor, racial and ethnic minorities, undocumented immigrants, and women.
So thank you very much, If you'd like to learn more about the work that we do, please feel free to contact Edgar or myself. You can also visit our website, and we're active on social media, so please check us out. And we'd be happy to take any questions if we have some time.
Great. Thank you so much, Katelyn and Edgar and Sylvia. We do have some time for questions. I think Paz will field those questions and ask them of the presenters. And so let's open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Yes, this is Paz Ardasa Regan with Catholic Climate Covenant. And I do have a few questions. The first ones are for Dr. Hood Washington. Dr. Hood Washington, and it is your mic that is the issue, because the moment that you unmute, we got the echo.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
I said that the moment you unmuted yourself, we got the echo. But the question is, where do children get mercury? So what are the sources of mercury?
The primary source of mercury is from power plants that use coal and oil, carbon-based fossil fuel plants. It comes to the stack and it's made into what they call organic mercury, methyl mercury. Did you hear the response?
Yes, with much less echo. The second question that I had there was if you could define what a Superfund site is.
The Superfund site is comes out of the EPA legislation. There's high levels of toxic material, whether it's from radioactive material or things like vinyl chloride. Is something that goes through the process of the US EPA and the US EPA legislation scientific criteria. So they could just high levels of toxic materials that are impacting the human body. Love Canal was what you would consider one of your first Superfund sites and designated as such, and created the legislation to protect public health from those types of dumping sites that had direct consequences on human health. Did you hear that?
Great, thank you. There was a question that dealt with the whole issue of overpopulation. And if you or somebody else might talk about that. I know you answered it in the chat, but if you could do it for everybody.
So my response to overpopulation is that when you talk about climate change and environmental racism, what you're talking about really is toxic materials coming into the environment and human beings being exposed to that. The toxic materials, Superfund sites, high levels of particulate is not due from overpopulation. It's due to individuals and countries who have been industrialized and producing chemicals from industrialization that has changed the actual ecosystem of the globe. It has nothing to do with how many people are having children. So it's not about telling people to reduce how many children they have, so much as to tell people how to use the resources, the limited resources of the globe in a more responsible way, and to really be in compliance with the regulations that we know need to be in place to stop those chemicals from poisoning all of our ecosystems. So that's my response to overpopulation.
Great, thank you. This question is for Katelyn and Edgar. If you had to prioritize the issues to address, which ones would be priorities, and how can the Catholic community support those priorities?
Well, I think here certainly air quality is a top priority for us because it very clearly impacts communities of color, children, and the elderly first and worst. But it may not be that that's the most pressing issue everywhere. And so I would encourage you to do a little bit of research where you are locally and see what a local environmental justice issue might be. Our parishes here, I mean, not all of them, but we have a number who have become very engaged on very in their own community, or things that their parish can do, like putting in a garden in their parish. But they're also, like you saw in that first picture, have been involved going to our state capitol and speaking directly to the people making the decisions about air quality regulations for the state and explaining why it is so meaningful to them and their families. And it's really powerful for elected officials to hear directly from the people who are suffering the most. And to hear from regular parishioners that this is something you care about because of your faith. It is one thing to hear about or hear from people who do this professionally, but it is way more meaningful when it's a group from a parish or neighborhood group speaking to these issues.
And kind of following up on that, a lot of questions are coming in as to how to get parishes involved. How do you do it? They're asking about how do you highlight the stories? Where do you get them? Things like that.
Well, the stories come from the parishes. So, I mean, many of the people are living this reality. Monica is a parishioner here in our diocese. So she's somebody that we know. And so many of our parishioners live this. This is their reality. So it's not like we have to go searching for stories, unfortunately. And they are very interested to get involved. They're very interested with things that are local, mostly. It's a little bit harder in our experience to motivate parishioners who have, limited time and limited means, like all of us, to take on climate change. But to take on access to healthy food in their neighborhood, that's something that they can see and understand on a day-to-day basis. And that's been really powerful. And as far as how we do that, I really, that's a good question for Edgar, who's done a lot of pounding the pavement to meet with priests and parish leaders. And Edgar, do you want to speak a little bit to that? It's okay. They can hear you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, one of the things that is really helpful is speaking with someone at the parish has a particular interest. I started by meeting with all of the pastors at each of the parishes. So engaging with if it's at the local one, if you're working just at one parish, I would try to find the pastor, if not the associate priest, and start there. And if not, see if there's a way to start a social justice ministry at the parishes, or talk to some folks on the ground. I've had that opportunity to meet with them. So prior to me engaging in this position, I had that opportunity. But there are different ways to reach out, whether it's through a bulletin announcement, whether it's through the announcements that they make at the church. There's different ways of going about it. We also have a radio program in Spanish that we talk about environmental justice issues that is with the local Catholic Spanish radio station. So that's another way of reaching out to a lot of different folks.
Great, thank you. And I'll do a little plug here for the Creation Care Teams as well. If anybody wants to have information, email me or go on to our website and look up Creation Care Teams. It's a good way for parishes to start working on these issues. At this point, I have a question. I think it's more for Dr. Hood Washington, but it could also be for Katelyn and Edgar. And it's really about how does Laudato Si, how do you see it as a framework for climate justice?
Sylvia, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to let Kate. So for me, when I look at the climate justice, protecting the most vulnerable people from climate change, it's a framework for getting into the cities, getting to those areas, I don't get too technical, that are experiencing what they call the heat island effect. So in Chicago in 1995, we had 700 people die in the city of Chicago from the heat wave. Most of these people were elderly, minority males who did not have access to air conditioning, who were left alone. And so it means reaching out to individuals and communities that we know cannot withstand the heat waves. reaching out to individuals who we know don't have adequate resources in dealing with floods in their areas, and reaching out to them and giving them safety nets. And I think the parishes can do a wonderful job of just like linking to senior citizen homes or linking to other community organizations and just being aware that this is happening and servicing those communities.
Katelyn, Edgar, do you have anything else to add?
I think what we have done is we have a third staff member, Yolanda, who has put together a great bilingual program that takes those same themes that Dr. Hood Washington talked about from Laudato Si and introduces it in a very accessible way. And we've done it for special presentations at parishes, but also for a social justice committee meeting or a pastoral council meeting. Youth groups, I mean, anybody who will listen to us, really. But it's really based on those 9 themes and unpacking each of those a little bit with some reflection for how that theme applies in your own life, but also what are some concrete action steps you can take around each of those themes. I will say another way that we have been, I think, uniquely effective is partnering closely with our Respect Life office at the diocese. And that has sort of opened up new conversations that I don't think had ever been there before Laudato Si. And so that connection of, that environmental justice is part of a respect for life is something we're trying to illustrate in how we work together with the parishes. So that might also be something to consider as you look at how to incorporate Laudato Si in social justice work you're already doing, but also environmental justice.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to end with one last question. And this one, I think it's mostly for Dan, though others can chime in. Dan, the question is, are there clean energy initiatives in place for parishes, either in Stockton or elsewhere in the US? And are parishes converting from traditional dirty energy sources to others, and how can they be helped?
Thanks for the question. We at Catholic Climate Covenant are starting a new program called Catholic Covenant Energies, and it's really a program that we're piloting first in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, working with maybe a dozen parishes that we're working to try to find ways for these parishes to save energy on their electric bills and gas bills and water bills. And we're doing that in collaboration with an organization out of Chicago called CSIP, the Conservation and Sustainability Interfaith Partnership. And we're also working with the Sustainable Endowments Institute to try to create a revolving loan fund, a green revolving loan fund that will enable us to enable the parishes to afford some of the more expensive ways to drive down energy, such as a new boiler system or something like that. So we're piloting this program right now in Cincinnati. We hope to be able to roll it out in 6 months to a year more broadly. But there are a number of places, for instance, in the Archdiocese of Chicago that are really trying to drive down energy costs and energy use. First, by benchmarking all the buildings. There's 2,700 buildings that the Archdiocese owns. So they're first measuring the impact of their climate footprint in the Archdiocese, and then working with parishes, individual pastors, and facilities managers to try to begin to reduce that energy use. It's a great way to start in this work with parishes, especially if you have pastors who are not quite interested or understand the issues around energy use and the connection to climate change. You can show them how they can save money, and that's one way to get their attention. And then when you begin to talk about Laudato Si and the importance and how this is part of our faith. So we are working in that direction, and we're moving more and more in that direction. Unfortunately, the program's not quite ready to go national, and nor do we have the funding or the staff to be able to respond to what the need might be. But yeah, we're certainly looking at some of that. there are not a lot of dioceses that I know of that are doing a tremendous amount of work in this area, with the exception of Stockton and Cincinnati and Chicago. I think I know that there are other dioceses that have studied the issues a little bit more. I'm thinking of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux in Louisiana and a few others, but it's and some are frankly doing it, and we just don't know about it. So, but of the ones I know, those four in particular are ones that are taking the lead here.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think that is it for the questions at the moment.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for this webinar. Again, we apologize for some of the audio difficulties. We'll do better next time, I promise. But I think this has been highly informative. Thank you, Katelyn and Edgar, and especially Dr. Washington, for your contributions to this. I think it was very enlightening, and we look forward to the next one. And watch your emails for our next webinar, and have a great day. Thank you so much.